Hello and welcome. These recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam and will go over some of the more common Paper 4 questions for the depth study of Germany. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your general revision. Today we will be looking at the early Weimar Republic and answering the following question. How significant were the problems faced by the Weimar Republic between the years 1919 to 1923? Technique is different for a paper 4. You have 1 hour and a choice from 2 questions. So it's a proper essay, and technique should be advanced. So let's get started. What problems did the new republic face? In tackling this question, it's crucial that you start with a short, sharp introduction which sets your essay up nicely, and it should follow the DCO rule. That is to say, define the question's key terms, give a small amount of context, and outline your scope. And for this essay, we will give a 5-point scope. So, in defining key terms, you may wish to either give a definition of what you consider problems to be, or you might want to give a definition of the time frame, in other words, the early Weimar Republic, and state that it's 1919 to 23. In terms of context, you may wish to explain that this was a noble experiment in democracy, and that prior to this, Germany had been ruled by an autocratic Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Finally, we will signpost the examiner by giving our 5-point scope, and in our final sentence of the introduction stating that this essay will explore the following areas: the Treaty of Versailles, the Constitution, left-wing opposition groups and right-wing opposition groups, and then finally our 5th point, economic reasons. So, point 1, the Treaty of Versailles. Evidence to support that the Treaty of Versailles was a significant problem for the new republic include: well, the Versailles Treaty was signed on the 28th of June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, just outside of Paris. And this was especially significant, not just because the delegates ate macaroons, but because this was the location where the German nation had been proclaimed earlier. The peace settlement was signed by Germany by a man called Gustav Bauer. He was a member of the new socialist government, formed in January 1919 in the small town of Weimar, and the republic was led by a man called Friedrich Ebert. But the peace treaty was regarded as a diktat, or a dictated peace, and the implications of it were significant for German society and for any new form of government. In terms of land, Germany lost about 13% of its European territory. Its colonial empire was shared among the winners. Alsace-Lorraine, which provided 75% of Germany's iron resources, was returned to France. The Saar was handed over to the League of Nations for 15 years, and the French took over the running of German coal mines. West Prussia was given to Poland in order to create access to the sea, and this effectively split Germany in two. Versailles also impacted upon Germany in terms of reparations. Now, although the actual sum was not set in Versailles, reparations were outlined in the form of a blank cheque, and it was later settled at £6.6 billion UK pounds in 1921. Moreover, the German army was limited to 100,000 and conscription was banned. Tanks and submarines were banned, and the navy was limited to just 6 warships. The air force was completely dismantled, and the Rhineland had to be demilitarized for 15 years whilst there could be no Anschluss with Austria. Our final piece of evidence to support the Treaty of Versailles being a significant problem is the War Guilt Clause, also known as Article 231. This held that Germany was to be wholly responsible for the war, and it later led to the Dolchstoß or stab in the back theory. So in explaining this point, we may argue that the Treaty of Versailles was a significant problem for the early Republic to overcome, and that it was a millstone around the neck of the noble experiment of democracy. Point 2. The Weimar Constitution. This was agreed in August 1919, and it was the idea of lawyer Hugo Preuss, and evidence to support this includes Article 48. This allowed the President of the Weimar Republic to suspend Parliament in times of emergency. Now, we know that Hitler used this to establish a dictatorship after the Reichstag fire, but it had been used many times during the Weimar period. The Constitution also allowed for a system known as proportional representation, whereby parties gained the same percentage of seats in the Reichstag as votes, and this allowed very small parties to be a part of the Reichstag. In total, there were 6 coalition governments, and this undermined the credibility of the Weimar Republic because it had a hard time agreeing on anything. And so in explaining our second point, you could argue that the Constitution was a significant problem for the early Republic. Point 3. Left-wing opposition groups. Evidence to support this include the German Communist Party was committed to establishing a Bolshevik style of government in Germany, as had happened in Russia in 1917. The Spartacist Rising took place in January 1919 in Berlin. It ended bloodily by the Freikorps, and the killer of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, Otto Runge, was given a very lenient prison sentence. The Freikorps were bands of extreme right-wing ex-soldiers, and they hated communism and what they regarded as Bolshevism. And the leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Poland's Rosa Luxemburg, who was disabled, were tortured before their death. There was another left-wing uprising in the Ruhr in March 1920, where communists staged an uprising, and also they briefly took over in Munich in April before the German army restored order. So in explaining point 3, you may wish to claim that left-wing opposition made life extremely difficult for the new democratic government. Point 4. The right-wing opposition. Linking on neatly with point 3, evidence to support this include German nationalists, of whom there were many, did not accept the Weimar Republic because of the government's decision to accept the Treaty of Versailles. They favoured the restoration of the monarchy or of an authoritarian leader, which is all they'd known. The Kapp Putsch took place in March 1920, where Dr. Wolfgang Kapp and General von Luttwitz attempted to overthrow the government. 12,000 soldiers had joined Freikorps units to seize control of Berlin, and Defence Minister Gustav Noske ordered the Reichswehr, or German army, to restore order. General von Seeckt refused to order his troops to attack former soldiers, and trade unions organised a general strike that paralysed Berlin. After 4 days, Kapp realised the putsch had failed and fled to Sweden. Secondly, we have the beer hall putsch in November 1923. On the 8th of November, Hitler and 600 SA took over a political meeting and announced that they were mounting a Nazi revolution. Von Kahr, the Bavarian state commissioner, who had been leading the meeting, escaped, and the Bavarian police and army refused to support the Nazi revolution. On the next day, the 9th of November, 2,000 SA men marched on the centre of Munich. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler slipped and broke his collarbone when fleeing and was arrested. In February 1924, Hitler was tried and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg jail, of which he served only 9 months. So all of this evidence suggests that right-wing opposition were significant problems for the new democratic Weimar government. Point 5. Our final point is about economic reasons. Now, we already know that World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, had really crippled the German economy, but there is further evidence to support this. Remember, 75% of German iron ore was lost with the Rhineland. But matters in 1923, where hyperinflation took hold, really made things worse. Many of you will have seen pictures of women dressing up in dresses made of notes, or heard stories of people burning money for fuel. The value of the mark had declined, and the government began to print more money, which led to hyperinflation following the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr, in which Albert Schlageter was killed by foreign troops. The value of the mark against the pound had gone from 20 to 1 to 16 billion to 1 from 1914 to 1923, and unemployment rose from 2% to 23%. The occupation of the Ruhr had been a response to the failure of the Weimar Republic to pay reparations. French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré initiated the invasion on January the 11th, 1923. The Ruhr, remember, was the centre of German coal, iron and steel production. The occupation boosted sympathy for Germany, but the League of Nations took no action, despite the fact it was a clear breach of rules, and occupation ended only in August 25th, 1925. So in explaining this point, we could say that 1923 in particular was a bad year economically for Germany, and that this was a significant problem for the early republic. So we have argued that significant problems included the Treaty of Versailles, the Constitution, left-wing opposition, right-wing opposition, and economic problems in 1923. So now it's time for our clever conclusion. Many historians have argued that the problems, particularly stemming from World War I, were a millstone around the early Weimar Republic's neck. Certainly, there were substantial issues, and it was born out of defeat. However, it is argued here that the recovery that comes about between 1924 to 1929 suggests that there is a small inkling or suggestion that it was not destined to fail. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or to subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.